Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that changed America forever. Not through war, not through politics, but through your grocery cart. We're talking about how 1980s food companies engineered your cravings, rewired your brain, and turned snacking into a national obsession. Before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to Sarah from Portland who suggested this topic. Your idea sparked something wild, and I'm genuinely grateful. Comments like yours shape this channel more than you know. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And hey, we're now live on Spotify too. Links in the description if you want to take us on the go. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe hide your Doritos because after tonight, you'll never look at them the same way. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered why you can't eat just one chip? Why does your hand keep reaching into the bag even when you're not hungry? What made processed foods so irresistible that an entire generation got hooked? How did companies convince us that cheese dust on our fingers was normal? Could you survive a week without touching anything that came in a crinkly package? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1980. Ronald Reagan is president, MTV just launched, and food scientists in laboratories are about to change your brain chemistry forever. Welcome to the golden age of processed food addiction. In the early 1980s, something shifted in America's kitchens. Mothers who had once spent hours preparing meals from scratch were suddenly opening boxes, tearing pouches and microwaving dinner in minutes. It wasn't laziness, it was liberation, or so the commercials said. Food companies had figured out the ultimate equation. Convenience plus shelf life equals profit. Frozen dinners, instant mashed potatoes, shelf-stable cheese spreads, all of it promised more time for living and less time for cooking. But convenience came with a hidden cost, one that wouldn't show up on the nutrition label for decades. Let's talk about what convenience actually meant. In the 1950s and 60s, women were still expected to prepare elaborate dinners, pot roasts, casseroles, desserts from scratch. It was exhausting, time-consuming, and limiting. But by the 1980s, more women were entering the workforce, and the old model wasn't working anymore. Food companies saw an opportunity and pounced. They weren't just selling food, they were selling freedom, or at least the illusion of it. The microwave became the symbol of this new era. Suddenly you could cook, heat, a meal in under 5 minutes. Frozen dinners went from soggy airline food to surprisingly edible comfort meals. Stouffer's, Swanson, Lean Cuisine, they all promised restaurant quality, without the restaurant. And people believed it because they wanted to believe it. After a long day at work, who wouldn't want dinner ready in 3 minutes? But here's the thing about convenience. It always costs something. In this case, it cost nutrition. To make food shelf-stable for months or years, companies had to strip out anything that might spoil. Fresh ingredients, natural fats, real flavors. Then they replaced them with preservatives, stabilizers, artificial flavors, and mountains of sodium. A frozen dinner didn't taste good because it was good. It tasted good because scientists engineered it to taste good despite being basically edible cardboard held together with salt and chemicals. And it wasn't just frozen dinners. Boxed macaroni and cheese, instant ramen, canned soups, pre-packaged snack cakes. Convenience invaded every corner of the grocery store. Parents could pack a lunch in 30 seconds. Kids could make their own breakfast without supervision. Dinner didn't require recipes, skills, or time. Just a box, a microwave, and low expectations. The marketing was brilliant. Commercials showed happy families gathering around the table, smiling over their instant mashed potatoes and preformed chicken nuggets. They showed busy mums breezing through their day because dinner was handled. They showed kids thriving because they had more time with their parents. It was all aspirational, all emotional and all deeply effective. What they didn't show was what happened over time. The weight gain, the health problems, the loss of cooking skills passed down through generations, the disconnect between food and where it actually comes from. Convenience meant you never had to think about food, where it grew, how it was made, what went into it. You just opened the box and ate. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We loved it. Americans embraced processed food with open arms because it solved real problems, it saved time, it saved money, it saved effort, and in the moment, that felt like winning. We didn't realize we were trading our health for convenience, one microwaved meal at a time. By the end of the 1980s, convenience had become the norm. Home cooking was quaint, old-fashioned, something your grandmother did. The future was packaged, processed, and ready in minutes. Saturday morning cartoons weren't just selling toys, they were selling sugar by the bowlful. Cereal companies in the 1980s turned breakfast into a battlefield, and kids were the target demographic. Bright colours, cartoon mascots, prizes in every box, and enough sugar to make a candy bar blush. Parents thought they were serving their children a wholesome start to the day. Meanwhile, food scientists were calibrating sweetness levels to trigger maximum dopamine response in developing brains. Breakfast wasn't fuel anymore, it was the first hit of the day. Walk down the cereal aisle in any grocery store in 1985 and you'd think you accidentally wandered into a toy store. Every box screamed for attention, neon colours, cartoon characters, promises of free toys inside. Lucky Charms, Fruit Loops, Cap'n Crunch, Cookie Crisp. These weren't just cereals. They were entertainment, collectibles, and sugar bombs all rolled into one brightly coloured package. The mascots were genius. Tony the Tiger, Toucan Sam, the Trix Rabbit. These characters became more recognisable to kids than historical figures or even family members. They had personalities, catchphrases, and TV shows. Kids didn't just want the cereal, they wanted to be friends with the mascot, and that emotional connection meant brand loyalty that lasted decades. But let's talk about what was actually in the box. Some cereals were more than 40% sugar by weight. That's not breakfast, that's dessert masquerading as nutrition. A bowl of Fruit Loops had more sugar than a glazed donut. Cookie Crisp was literally cookies in a bowl with milk. And yet, parents poured it every morning, believing the part of a complete breakfast lie printed on the box. Food companies defended themselves by pointing to added vitamins. Sure, the cereal was mostly sugar, but they'd fortified it with vitamin D and iron. It was basically medicine, right? Wrong. Spraying synthetic vitamins onto sugar doesn't make it healthy. It's like dousing a cigarette in vitamin C and calling it wellness. The prize inside the box was another stroke of evil genius. Kids would beg their parents to buy a specific cereal not because they liked the taste, but because they wanted the cheap plastic toy buried in the bag. Companies knew this. They designed toys specifically to drive purchases. Limited editions, collectible series, toys that tied into popular movies or shows. It was marketing brilliance and nutritional sabotage. And it wasn't just the cereal itself. The commercials were relentless. Saturday morning TV was a 3-hour sugar advertisement disguised as entertainment. Between cartoon episodes, kids were bombarded with jingles, jokes, and promises that eating this cereal would make them cooler, faster, stronger, happier. The psychological manipulation was so effective that the Federal Trade Commission tried to ban it in the late 1970s. The food industry fought back and won. Parents were complicit, but not because they didn't care. They were busy, tired, and overwhelmed. A cereal that their kids would actually eat without a fight felt like a victory. And the boxes said fortified and whole grain, so it couldn't be that bad, right? The companies counted on that exhaustion, that trust, that desire for an easy morning. By the mid-1980s, the average American child was consuming more sugar before 8 a.m. than people in previous generations ate in an entire day. Their taste buds were being conditioned to crave sweetness at levels that would have seemed absurd just 20 years earlier. Natural flavors, the taste of actual fruit, whole grains, nuts, became boring, bland, unacceptable. And here's the kicker. Once you train a child's brain to expect that level of sweetness, it's almost impossible to go back. Plain oatmeal tastes like cardboard. Fresh fruit isn't sweet enough. Anything unsweetened becomes unpalatable. Food companies didn't just sell cereal. They rewired an entire generation's sense of taste. Breakfast became dessert and nobody blinked. We just kept pouring. Deep in corporate laboratories, food scientists discovered something extraordinary. The bliss point. It wasn't a place. It was a precise combination of sugar, salt, and fat that triggered the brain's reward system like a slot machine jackpot. Companies hired mathematicians, chemists, and psychologists to calculate the exact ratios that would make you reach for one more bite, one more handful, one more bag. They weren't just making food, they were designing cravings. And they were very, very good at it. The bliss point isn't some vague concept, it's science, cold and calculated. Imagine a graph where the x-axis is the amount of sugar, salt, or fat in a product, and the y-axis is how much pleasure a person experiences eating it. At low levels, the food is bland. At high levels, it becomes overwhelming, even unpleasant. But somewhere in the middle, there's a peak, a sweet spot where the flavor is so perfectly calibrated that your brain lights up like a Christmas tree. That's the bliss point. Food companies discovered this in the 1980s and weaponized it. They didn't just stumble upon delicious recipes, they engineered them with scientific precision. Teams of food scientists conducted thousands of taste tests, adjusting formulas by fractions of a percent until they found the exact combination that made people say, "I can't stop eating this. Let's break it down." Sugar triggers dopamine, the same neurotransmitter released during sex, drugs, and other intensely pleasurable experiences. Your brain doesn't distinguish between types of pleasure, it just knows it wants more. So when you eat something at the sugar bliss point, your brain sends a signal. Do that again, immediately. Salt works differently, but just as effectively. It enhances flavor, suppresses bitterness, and creates a savory satisfaction that feels deeply comforting. But too much salt, and the food becomes inedible. Too little, and it tastes flat. The bliss point for salt is the exact amount where your taste buds sing without your brain registering too salty. You just keep eating. Fat is the final piece of the puzzle. It carries flavor better than anything else, creates a creamy, satisfying texture, and signals to your brain that you're eating something calorie-dense and valuable. From an evolutionary perspective, fat meant survival. Your ancestors' brains were wired to seek it out. Food companies hijacked that ancient wiring and turned it into a sales strategy. Here's where it gets sinister. The bliss point isn't about satisfying hunger. It's about triggering cravings that override hunger signals entirely. You can be full, genuinely, physically full, and still want another handful of chips, another cookie, another sip of soda. That's not hunger. That's your brain begging for another dopamine hit. And companies didn't stop at one bliss point. They created layered experiences. A chip might hit the salt bliss point on your tongue, the fat bliss point in your mouth, and the crunch bliss point in your ears. Every sense was targeted, every moment of eating engineered for maximum pleasure and minimum satisfaction. Because if you felt truly satisfied, you'd stop eating, and that's bad for business. They tested these formulas on focus groups, tracking facial expressions, measuring brain activity, analysing how quickly people reach for more. If a product didn't score high enough on the craving scale, it was reformulated and tested again. This wasn't cooking. It was chemistry, psychology, and addiction, science rolled into one. The goal was never to nourish, it was to hook, to create a product so irresistible that you'd buy it again and again, that you'd crave it between purchases, that you'd feel a little thrill just seeing it on the shelf. The bliss point wasn't discovered by accident. It was calculated, tested, and deployed with the precision of a military operation. And it worked. By the end of the 1980s, Americans were eating more processed food than ever before, and they couldn't figure out why they couldn't stop. The answer was simple: they were never supposed to. Salt is ancient, essential, and wildly addictive. Food companies in the 1980s knew this and weaponized it. They loaded everything with sodium, crackers, chips, frozen meals, canned soups, even bread. The average American's salt intake skyrocketed, but it wasn't just about taste. Salt made you thirsty, which meant you bought more soda. It masked the staleness of processed ingredients. It created a craving loop that kept you coming back. Your body needed a pinch. They gave you an avalanche. Let's start with why salt works so well. Human beings are biologically programmed to seek out salt because we need it to survive. Sodium regulates fluid balance, nerve function, and muscle contractions. Without it, we die. Our ancestors didn't have salt shakers. They had to hunt for it, trade for it, fight for it. Salt was currency, power, survival. So when you taste salt, your brain doesn't just register flavor, it registers life. Food companies understood this primal response and exploited it ruthlessly. In the 1980s, the amount of sodium in processed food skyrocketed. A single frozen dinner could contain more than half your daily recommended intake. A can of soup, nearly a full day's worth. A bag of chips, off the charts. And people loved it because salt makes everything taste better, even food that has no business tasting good. Here's the dirty trick. Salt doesn't just enhance flavor, it masks flaws. Stale bread, add salt. Cheap meat, add salt. Flavorless vegetables that have been frozen for 6 months, add salt. It's the ultimate fixer, the magician trick that makes low-quality ingredients taste acceptable, even delicious. Without salt, most processed food would taste like the cardboard boxes it came in. But salt does something even more insidious. It creates thirst. And thirsty people buy drinks, big gulp sodas, supersized soft drinks, endless refills, all of it driven by the sodium bomb you just ate. Food and beverage companies weren't operating independently. They were partners in a beautifully orchestrated scheme. Sell them salty food, then sell them sugary drinks to wash it down. Repeat until their kidneys beg for mercy. And just like sugar, salt has a bliss point. Too little, and food tastes bland. Too much, and it's inedible. But hit that perfect spot, and your taste buds light up. Food scientists in the 1980s spent millions finding that exact point for every product. Crackers, pretzels, popcorn, chips, cured meats, canned vegetables. They tested, adjusted, and tested again until they found the formula that made you reach for more. But here's the problem. The more salt you eat, the more you need to taste it. Your taste buds adapt. What once tasted perfectly salty now tastes bland. So you seek out saltier foods, and the cycle continues. It's not addiction in the clinical sense, but it's damn close. You're chasing a taste you can never quite recapture, always needing just a little bit more. The health consequences didn't matter to the companies. High blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, those were future problems. Profit was now, and salt was cheap, effective, and universally craved. It was the perfect ingredient. Even foods you wouldn't expect were loaded with sodium. Breakfast cereals, sweet, sugary cereals contain shocking amounts of salt. Why? Because salt balances sweetness, it makes sugar taste even better. Bread, rolls, bagels, all packed with sodium to extend shelf life and enhance flavour. Even healthy foods like canned beans, frozen vegetables and low-fat yogurt were secretly sodium bombs. By the mid-1980s, the average American was consuming nearly double the recommended daily sodium intake, and most of it wasn't coming from the salt shaker on the table. It was hidden in every processed, packaged, pre-made product they touched. It was invisible, insidious, and everywhere. Doctors started sounding alarms. Nutritionists warned about sodium and hypertension, but food companies pushed back, funding studies that downplayed the risks and lobbying against regulations. They argued that people loved salt, that it was a personal choice, that reducing sodium would make food taste worse and sales would plummet. And they were probably right about that last part. Salt wasn't just a seasoning in the 1980s, it was a strategy, a way to make cheap food irresistible, to create cravings, to drive sales. Your body needed a pinch. They gave you an avalanche, and you kept coming back for more. Fat doesn't just add calories, it adds pleasure. In the 1980s, food scientists discovered that fat carries flavour better than any other ingredient. It coats your tongue, satisfies your brain, and signals comfort. So they pumped it into everything: cookies, chips, frozen dinners, even healthy granola bars, trans fats, hydrogenated oils, mystery fats with chemical names. None of it mattered as long as it made the product irresistible. Fat became the secret weapon in the war for your wallet. Let's be clear, fat is delicious. It's why butter makes everything better, why fried food is universally loved, why ice cream feels like a hug from the inside. Fat isn't the villain it was made out to be in the 1990s. It's actually essential for health, hormone production, and brain function. But the fat in processed food, that's a different beast entirely. In the 1980s, food scientists figured out that fat is a flavor delivery system. Spices, seasonings, and natural flavors dissolve in fat and spread across your tongue in a way that water-based ingredients can't match. That's why fried chicken tastes better than boiled chicken, why a croissant beats plain bread, why cheese makes everything better. Fat carries flavor, and your brain rewards you for eating it. So food companies started adding fat to everything, not because the food needed it, but because fat made it taste better and feel more satisfying. Cookies weren't just sweet, they were buttery, rich, melt-in-your-mouth indulgent. Chips weren't just salty, they were fried to crispy perfection in oils that left a lingering, almost addictive aftertaste. Frozen dinners weren't just convenient, they were swimming in creamy sauces that masked the fact the ingredients were garbage. But not all fats are created equal. The fats in whole foods, nuts, avocados, olive oil, fish, are nourishing. The fats in 1980s processed food were engineered. Enter trans fats and hydrogenated oils, the Frankenstein fats that food companies loved because they were cheap, shelf-stable, and made everything taste amazing. Hydrogenation is a chemical process where liquid oils are bombarded with hydrogen atoms until they become solid at room temperature. This makes them perfect for processed food, they don't spoil, they have a long shelf life, and they create a satisfying texture. Crisco, margarine, shortening, all hydrogenated, and they were in everything: crackers, cookies, microwave popcorn, frozen pizza, coffee creamers, even bread. The problem? Trans fats are toxic. They raise bad cholesterol, lower good cholesterol, and significantly increase the risk of heart disease. But in the 1980s, nobody knew that yet, or if they did, they weren't talking about it. Trans fats were considered a miracle ingredient, a cheaper alternative to butter that performed even better in manufacturing. And fat does something else that companies loved. It makes you feel full temporarily, but not satisfied long term. You eat a bag of chips fried in cheap oil, and for a moment you feel satiated. But an hour later you're hungry again, reaching for more. That's because processed fats don't trigger the same satiety signals as whole food fats. They trick your brain into thinking you've eaten something substantial when you really haven't. Food scientists also discovered that fat amplifies the bliss point. Combine fat with sugar, and you get cookies, ice cream, chocolate. Combine fat with salt, and you get chips, fries, bacon. The combinations are endless, and every single one lights up your brain's reward system like a fireworks show. Fat also creates what scientists call mouthfeel, the texture and sensation of food in your mouth. Creamy, smooth, rich, velvety. These aren't just adjectives. They're engineered experiences. Companies spent millions perfecting the mouthfeel of their products because texture is just as important as taste. A cookie that crumbles perfectly, ice cream that melts at the ideal rate, a chip that dissolves just right on your tongue, all of it designed, tested, and optimized. Even foods marketed as healthy were packed with fat. Low-fat yogurt, loaded with sugar to compensate. But full-fat yogurt was vilified, so people avoided it and ate the sugar bomb instead. Granola bars, trail mix, protein bars, all marketed as wholesome, all packed with vegetable oils and hydrogenated fats that made them taste like candy bars. By the end of the 1980s, fat wasn't just an ingredient, it was the foundation of processed food success. It made everything tastier, more addictive, and more profitable. And while the fat-free craze of the 1990s would try to demonize it, the damage was already done. An entire generation had learned to crave fat in its most processed, least nutritious forms. Fat wasn't the enemy, but the way food companies used it? That was a different story entirely. Snacking wasn't always normal. In the 1950s and 60s you ate 3 meals a day, and maybe a piece of fruit in between. But by the 1980s, food companies had convinced America that snacking was essential, practically patriotic. Granola bars for energy, chips for relaxation, candy for a pick-me-up. They invented problems and sold solutions wrapped in foil. Before you knew it, you were eating 6 times a day, and every single one of those times, a corporation was profiting. Let's rewind for a second. The concept of snacking as a cultural norm didn't really exist before the mid-20th century. People ate meals. If they were hungry between meals, they ate leftovers or a piece of bread. Snack foods were treats, occasional indulgences, not daily necessities. But in the 1980s, that all changed. Food companies realized that 3 meals a day had a profit ceiling. People could only eat so much at breakfast, lunch and dinner, but snacks were limitless. Snacks could happen anytime, anywhere, for any reason. Bored? Snack. Tired? Snack. Happy? Celebrate with a snack. Sad? Comfort yourself with a snack. The beauty of snacks was that you didn't need to be hungry to eat them. So companies launched a propaganda campaign disguised as marketing. They told us that snacking was healthy, that eating smaller, more frequent meals kept your metabolism humming. They told us that snacks gave us energy to power through our busy days. They told us that kids needed snacks to focus in school and grow strong. None of it was based on solid science, but it sounded reasonable enough that people believed it. And then they flooded the market. Chips, crackers, cookies, candy bars, granola bars, fruit snacks, cheese crackers, popcorn, pretzels, jerky, trail mix, pudding cups, fruit roll-ups. The variety was staggering. There was a snack for every mood, every occasion, every demographic. Snacks for kids, snacks for athletes, snacks for dieters, snacks for road trips, snacks for offices, snacks for late-night TV watching. The packaging was genius. Single-serve bags made portion control a joke. You bought the small bag, ate it in 30 seconds, and immediately wanted another. Family-size bags were designed to be eaten in one sitting, despite the label claiming they contained 7 servings. Resealable bags were a lie. Nobody resealed them. You just kept reaching in until the bag was empty, wondering where it all went. Vending machines became ubiquitous. Schools, offices, hospitals, gyms, everywhere you turned, there was a machine ready to take your dollar and give you something salty, sweet, and completely devoid of nutrition. Vending machines were the perfect passive income for food companies. Install them, stock them, and watch the money roll in while Americans ate their way through boredom, stress, and long afternoons. And snacks weren't just sold in grocery stores anymore. Gas stations became snack palaces. Convenience stores were temples to processed food. You couldn't pump gas without being tempted by a wall of chips and candy visible through the window. Checkout aisles became snack gauntlets, designed to trigger impulse buys while you waited in line. Candy bars, gum, beef jerky, mints, all positioned at eye level, whispering just one more won't hurt. The marketing language was brilliantly manipulative. Snacks weren't junk food. They were convenient, portable, on-the-go fuel. Granola bars weren't candy bars with oats. They were wholesome energy. Fruit snacks weren't gummy candy. They were made with real fruit juice. Never mind that it was 2% juice and 98% corn syrup. Even chips rebranded themselves as baked, not fried or made with real vegetables, as if that somehow made them virtuous. And let's talk about the 100-calorie packs that came later, but had roots in 1980s thinking. The idea was brilliant in its deception. People felt guilty eating a whole bag of cookies, so companies sold them smaller bags with fewer cookies and charged more per ounce. Consumers felt virtuous eating a 100-calorie pack, completely ignoring that they usually ate 3 of them. Portion control became portion theatre. By the end of the decade, snacking had become so normalised that not snacking felt weird. Kids expected snacks in their lunchboxes, after school and before bed. Adults kept snacks in their desks, cars and purses. Eating became a constant activity, a background hum of chewing and crunching that never stopped from sunrise to midnight. Food companies had successfully convinced an entire nation that snacking wasn't indulgence, it was necessity. And in doing so, they created an empire built on manufactured hunger and engineered cravings. Children don't have defences. They can't distinguish advertising from entertainment, nutrition from nonsense, or manipulation from fun. Food companies knew this and spent billions targeting kids directly. Cartoon mascots, celebrity endorsements, toy tie-ins, sugary promises wrapped in bright packaging. Parents didn't stand a chance. Kids screamed for Lunchables, begged for Capri Suns, and threw tantrums in grocery store aisles. The strategy worked because it bypassed logic entirely and went straight for emotion. Let's set the scene. It's Saturday morning, 1985. You're 7 years old, sitting 3 feet from the TV in your pajamas, watching cartoons. Between episodes of He-Man and Transformers, commercials flood the screen, bright, loud, fast-paced, and aim directly at your underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. Cartoon characters dance, jingles burrow into your brain, prizes are promised, and by the end of the commercial break, you want Lucky Charms more than you've ever wanted anything in your life. This wasn't accidental. Food companies spent millions studying child psychology, understanding what colours attracted kids, what sounds held their attention, what narratives made them beg their parents to buy products. They learned that kids couldn't distinguish between a commercial and a cartoon, that they believed everything they saw on TV, and that repeated exposure to a brand created lifelong loyalty. The mascots were designed with surgical precision. Tony the Tiger wasn't just a cartoon, he was a friend, a role model, someone kids wanted to be like. The Trix Rabbit was the underdog kids rooted for. Cap'n Crunch was the adventurous captain they wanted to join. These characters had personalities, backstories, and Saturday morning TV shows. They weren't selling cereal, they were selling relationships. And the toys. Oh, the toys. Every cereal box promised a prize inside, some cheap plastic thing that cost pennies to manufacture, but felt like treasure to a kid. Decoder rings, race cars, stickers, minifigures, glow-in-the-dark gadgets. It didn't matter if the toy broke in 5 minutes. What mattered was that kids wanted it, and the only way to get it was to convince Mom to buy the cereal. But the manipulation didn't stop at TV. Food companies infiltrated schools. They sponsored educational programs, donated equipment, and plastered their logos everywhere in exchange for access to captive audiences. Pizza Hut's Book It program rewarded kids with free pizza for reading books, a noble cause wrapped around a corporate strategy to create lifelong pizza customers. Fast food chains used the same playbook. McDonald's Happy Meals weren't about the food, they were about the toy. Kids didn't care about the burger or fries. They cared about the latest Disney tie-in, the collectible toy, the miniature version of something they saw on TV. And once they associated McDonald's with fun, happiness and rewards, they'd crave it for the rest of their lives. Food companies also weaponized peer pressure. If all the cool kids at school had Lunchables, you needed Lunchables. If everyone else drank Capri Sun, plain water was boring and embarrassing. Social belonging was tied to brands, and kids are desperate to belong. Parents who said no were branded uncool, mean, or out of touch. The grocery store became a battlefield. Companies placed products at kid eye level, colourful boxes with cartoon characters staring directly at small, impressionable faces. Kids would spot their favourite mascot, grab the box, and refuse to let go. Parents, exhausted and worn down, often gave in just to avoid a meltdown in aisle 7. And the messaging was insidious. Commercials told kids that eating this cereal would make them stronger, faster, smarter, cooler. That drinking this juice would give them energy to play all day. That eating these snacks would make them popular. None of it was true, but kids believed it, because kids believe everything. The Federal Trade Commission tried to step in during the late 1970s, proposing restrictions on advertising to children. The food industry fought back with lobbying, lawsuits, and public relations campaigns. They argued that parents, not the government, should control what kids eat, ignoring the fact that they'd spent billions ensuring parents had no control at all. The regulations died, and the advertising continued, more aggressive than ever. By the end of the 1980s, an entire generation of kids had been conditioned to associate food with fun, love, and happiness. They didn't see commercials as manipulation, they saw them as truth. And when those kids grew up and had children of their own, the cycle continued. Brand loyalty didn't just last a lifetime, it lasted generations. Food companies didn't just market to kids, they colonized childhood itself. Cheese dust, that radioactive orange powder coating your fingers after a bag of Cheetos, is not cheese. It's a flavor compound engineered to be intensely satisfying, slightly addictive, and impossible to ignore. Companies discovered that by pulverizing and concentrating cheese flavor, they could trigger cravings more effectively than actual cheese ever could. It stuck to your fingers, forcing you to lick them clean, reinforcing the sensory experience. Cheese dust wasn't food, it was psychological warfare in powdered form. Let's start with a question. Have you ever opened a bag of Cheetos and managed to eat just one? Of course not. Nobody has. And that's not a coincidence, it's engineering. Cheese dust is one of the most brilliantly diabolical inventions in food history. And it all started with a simple observation. Cheese tastes good, but cheese powder tastes irresistible. The story begins with dehydrated cheese, which was originally invented for military rations. Soldiers needed portable protein, and powdered cheese was lightweight, shelf-stable, and packed with flavour. After World War II, food companies realised they could use the same technology for civilian products. But they didn't just want to replicate cheese, they wanted to intensify it, concentrate it, make it hit harder than the real thing. Enter cheese dust, a powdered blend of dehydrated cheese, salt, artificial flavours, colorants, hello, yellow number 6, and a cocktail of chemicals designed to amplify taste. When you eat it, the powder dissolves instantly on your tongue, flooding your taste buds with an intense burst of savoury, salty, slightly tangy flavour. It's more concentrated than natural cheese could ever be, and your brain registers it as a flavour bomb. But the brilliance of cheese dust isn't just in the taste, it's in the texture and the ritual. The powder clings to your fingers, leaving behind an unmistakable orange stain. And what do you do when your fingers are covered in cheese dust? You lick them. And in doing so, you get another hit of flavour, another dopamine spike. It's a feedback loop. Eat chip, lick fingers, crave more, repeat. Food scientists studied this behaviour obsessively. They watched people eat Cheetos in focus groups, tracking how often they licked their fingers, how quickly they reached for another chip, how long they could resist before opening another bag. They discovered that the finger licking wasn't a side effect, it was a feature. The more tactile and interactive the eating experience, the more memorable and craveable it became. And the texture of cheese dust matters too. It's fine enough to coat every surface of a chip, but substantial enough to feel like you're eating something rich and indulgent. It creates what food scientists call a dynamic contrast. The crispy chip against the powdery coating, the crunch followed by the melt. Every bite is a multi-sensory experience. The colour is also deliberate. That unnatural glowing orange isn't a mistake, it's a signal. Your brain associates bright colours with ripe fruit, with valuable nutrients, with food worth seeking out. The cheese dust isn't that colour by accident. It's designed to stand out on the shelf, to look appealing in commercials and to scream "eat me" to your subconscious. And cheese dust isn't just on Cheetos anymore. By the 1980s it had invaded the entire snack aisle. Cheese puffs, cheese crackers, cheese popcorn, cheese-flavoured chips. Anything that could be dusted was dusted. Companies even started selling shakers of cheese powder so you could add it to anything. Popcorn, pasta, vegetables, if you were feeling ambitious and deeply misguided. But here's the thing. Cheese dust doesn't taste like real cheese. If you did a blind taste test, actual cheddar and Cheetos powder wouldn't even register as the same food. Cheese dust is a hyper-real, exaggerated version of cheese flavour, the platonic ideal of cheesiness, divorced from any connection to milk cows or dairy farms. It's cheese as concept, not cheese as food. And that's the point. Real cheese is complicated. It has depth, subtlety, different notes depending on aging and origin. Cheese dust has one note, and it plays that note at maximum volume. It doesn't want to be complex, it wants to be craveable. The ingredient list for cheese dust reads like a chemistry experiment. Whey, cheddar cheese, sure, canola oil, maltodextrin, natural and artificial flavours, salt, disodium phosphate, lactic acid, yellow number 6. It's a Frankenstein creation, assembled in a lab, optimised for pleasure, and completely divorced from anything resembling real food. By the end of the 1980s, cheese dust had become so iconic that it transcended snack food. It was a cultural marker, a childhood memory, a tactile experience that entire generations associated with comfort and joy. You didn't just eat cheese dust, you wore it, licked it, craved it. And food companies knew exactly what they'd created. A flavour so engineered, so optimised, so irresistible, that it turned a simple snack into an obsession. In the early 1980s, high fructose corn syrup, HFCS, replaced sugar in nearly every processed food and drink in America. Why? Because it was cheap, shelf-stable, and sweeter than sugar. It didn't matter that your body metabolized it differently, or that it might contribute to obesity and diabetes. What mattered was profit margins. Soda, ketchup, bread, yogurt, salad dressing, HFCS was everywhere. And once it infiltrated the food supply, there was no going back. Let's start with the economics. In the 1970s, sugar was expensive. Trade restrictions, tariffs, and global supply issues made it a costly ingredient for food manufacturers. Meanwhile, American farmers were growing corn in massive surplus, and the government was subsidizing it heavily. Someone had a brilliant, terrible idea. What if we could turn corn into sugar? Scientists figured out how to break down cornstarch into glucose, then convert some of that glucose into fructose, creating a syrup that was roughly as sweet as table sugar but far cheaper to produce. High fructose corn syrup was born, and the food industry embraced it like a long-lost savior. By the early 1980s, HFCS had replaced sugar in almost every major soda brand. Coca-Cola and Pepsi made the switch quietly, betting that consumers wouldn't notice the difference. And for the most part, they didn't. HFCS tasted sweet. It dissolved well in liquid, and it was stable enough to sit on shelves for months without crystallizing or spoiling. It was perfect for manufacturers. But HFCS wasn't just in soda. It crept into everything. Ketchup, salad dressing, barbecue sauce, pasta sauce, bread, crackers, yogurt, cereal, granola bars, canned fruit, juice, sports drinks, and even products labelled healthy or natural. If it came in a package and tasted even slightly sweet, there was a good chance it contained high fructose corn syrup. The problem? Your body processes HFCS differently than regular sugar. While both contain glucose and fructose, the fructose in HFCS is absorbed faster and metabolized primarily in the liver. Some studies suggest this leads to increased fat storage, insulin resistance, and higher triglyceride levels, all risk factors for obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. But in the 1980s, and none of that was widely known or talked about, HFCS was just another ingredient. And because it was cheaper, companies could use more of it. Products got sweeter. Sodas went from moderately sweet to candy-level sweet. Ketchup became dessert in a bottle. Even bread, which shouldn't be sweet at all, started tasting faintly sugary. American palates shifted, recalibrating to expect everything to be just a little bit sweeter than it used to be. HFCS also extended shelf life, which was a massive advantage for manufacturers. Products could sit in warehouses and on store shelves longer without spoiling, reducing waste and increasing profitability. It was a win-win for corporations. But there was a darker side. Corn subsidies meant that junk food made with HFCS became cheaper than whole foods. A bag of chips cost less than a bag of apples. A 2-litre bottle of soda was cheaper than a carton of milk. A box of cookies was more affordable than fresh vegetables. HFCS didn't just change what was in food, it changed what people could afford to eat. And once HFCS infiltrated the food supply, it became nearly impossible to avoid. Even if you wanted to eat HFCS-free, you'd have to make everything from scratch. Bread, homemade. Sauce, homemade. Juice, freshly squeezed. For busy families in the 1980s, that wasn't realistic, so they ate it, often without knowing it, because HFCS was buried in ingredient lists under names like corn syrup, corn sweetener, or simply sweetener. The beverage industry was the biggest culprit. Soda consumption exploded in the 1980s, and HFCS was the fuel. A single can of Coke contained 9 teaspoons of sugar. or sugar equivalent HFCS. A big gulp from 7-Eleven contained more than 30 teaspoons. People were drinking their way through, more sugar in a day than their grandparents ate in a week. And the marketing was relentless. Soda companies spent billions convincing Americans that their products were refreshing, fun, essential to a good time. They sponsored concerts, sports events, movies. They plastered their logos everywhere. Drinking soda became as American as baseball, and HFCS was in every single drop. By the end of the 1980s, HFCS had fundamentally reshaped the American diet. It made junk food cheaper and more ubiquitous. It trained taste buds to crave sweetness at unnatural levels, and it set the stage for the obesity and diabetes epidemics that would explode in the following decades. High fructose corn syrup wasn't just a sweetener. It was a quiet revolution, one that changed what we ate, how much we ate, and what our bodies became as a result. In the 1980s, food companies discovered a simple truth. People will eat more if you give them more. So they supersized everything: sodas, fries, candy bars, popcorn buckets. A small became a medium became a large, and large became a bucket. Consumers thought they were getting a deal. In reality, they were being trained to normalize excess. Portion distortion wasn't an accident, it was a business model. Let's rewind to the 1950s. A standard soda was 6.5 ounces. A movie theatre popcorn was a modest bag. A burger was about 3 inches across. Fast forward to the 1980s. A medium soda was 20 ounces. A large popcorn required 2 hands. A burger was thick, stacked, and came with double everything. What happened? Food companies realized that the cost of ingredients was a tiny fraction of the total cost of a product. The expensive part was marketing, distribution, and packaging. So if they could convince people to buy larger sizes, the profit margins went through the roof. An extra 4 ounces of soda cost pennies, but could be sold for an extra $1. It was brilliant, ruthless capitalism. The genius was in the pricing. A small soda cost $1. A medium cost $1.25. A large cost $1.50. The difference seemed trivial, so why not upgrade? You got twice the soda for just 50 cents more. It felt like a bargain. But the goal was never to give you a deal, it was to make you consume more, crave more, and come back for more. Fast food chains led the charge. McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, they all started offering value meals that bundled oversized portions at a discount. You didn't just get a burger, you got a burger, large fries, and a large soda. Suddenly, eating massive amounts of food in one sitting was normal, even expected. And it wasn't just fast food. Movie theatres supersized their popcorn and soda. A small popcorn became a laughable option, something only children ordered. A large popcorn was bigger than your head, and you were expected to eat it all during a 2-hour movie. Candy bars doubled in size. A regular Snickers became a king size. A king size became a share pack that nobody ever shared. Restaurants followed suit. Portion sizes in sit-down restaurants ballooned. A plate of pasta went from a reasonable serving to a mountain of noodles. Steaks got thicker, desserts got taller, appetizers became meals, and doggy bags became the norm because nobody could finish what they ordered, but they sure tried. The psychology behind this was simple but effective. Humans are bad at estimating portion sizes. When food is in front of us, we eat it, even if we're not hungry. Studies show that people will eat more from a larger plate, drink more from a larger cup, and consume more from a larger package, even if they're already full. Food companies knew this and exploited it ruthlessly. But portion distortion didn't just make people eat more in the moment, it recalibrated their sense of normal. Kids growing up in the 1980s learned that large soda was a standard drink, that a king-size candy bar was a normal snack, that a plate piled high with food was what dinner looked like. When those kids became adults, their baseline for normal was already supersized. And it created a paradox. People felt like they were getting more for their money, but they were actually spending more overall. They bought bigger portions, ate more, got hungrier faster, thanks to blood sugar crashes, and bought more food to compensate. The cycle was self-reinforcing and highly profitable. By the end of the 1980s, portion distortion had become the invisible norm. Nobody questioned it because everyone was doing it. A medium soda in the 1980s was larger than a large soda in the 1950s, but it didn't feel excessive, it felt standard. And that's the most dangerous part. Excess had been normalized. More had become the baseline, and the human body, designed for scarcity, had no defenses against abundance. The 1980s launched the fat-free craze. Butter was evil, eggs were dangerous, and anything low-fat was healthy, or so we were told. Food companies gleefully stripped fat from products and replaced it with sugar, artificial flavors, and chemicals. Snackwell's cookies, fat-free yogurt, diet frozen dinners, all marketed as guilt-free. Meanwhile, obesity rates climbed. Turns out removing fat just made people hungrier, and the sugar rush kept them coming back. The war on fat began with good intentions, or at least intentions that sounded good. Scientists in the 1970s started linking dietary fat to heart disease. The message was simple. Fat clogs your arteries, so if you want to live, stop eating it. Never mind that humans have been eating fat for millions of years. Never mind that fat is essential for hormone production, brain function, and nutrient absorption. The message was out, and America listened. Food companies saw an opportunity disguised as a health crisis. They could reformulate their products, slap fat-free or low-fat on the label, and charge the same price or more for what was essentially a cheaper product to manufacture. They stripped the fat from cookies, crackers, ice cream, yogurt, salad dressing, cheese, and even peanut butter. Everything got the fat-free treatment. But here's the problem. Fat makes food taste good. Without it, everything tastes like cardboard. So companies had to compensate. Enter sugar, lots and lots of sugar. A fat-free cookie wasn't just missing fat. It was loaded with extra sugar, corn syrup, and artificial flavors to mask the fact that it tasted like sweetened chalk. Fat-free yogurt went from tangy and satisfying to cloyingly sweet and unsatisfying. Fat-free salad dressing became liquid candy. And consumers bought it. They bought it by the cartload because the label said fat-free and that meant healthy. Snackwell's cookies became a cultural phenomenon. People felt virtuous eating an entire box because they were fat-free, completely ignoring that. Each cookie was a sugar bomb, the calories were the same, sometimes higher, but the psychology was different. Fat-free felt like permission to overeat. What nobody understood at the time was that fat is satiating. When you eat fat, your body feels full and satisfied. Remove the fat and you're left hungry an hour later, reaching for another snack. So people ate more, not less. They'd eat a fat-free muffin for breakfast and be starving by 10 a.m. They'd snack on fat-free crackers all afternoon and still feel empty. The diet food trap was working exactly as designed, not to make people healthier, but to make them buy more. And the sugar didn't just make people hungry, it made them crave more sugar. Blood sugar spikes and crashes became the rhythm of the day. You'd eat something fat-free and sweet, get a quick energy boost, then crash an hour later and need another hit. It was a cycle of dependence, and food companies profited from every loop. The marketing was insidious. Commercials showed thin, happy, active people eating fat-free foods, implying that if you ate them too, you'd look like that. Magazine ads promised guilt-free indulgence. Grocery store displays put fat-free products at eye level, bathed in soft lighting, whispering, "This is the healthy choice." And people believed it because they desperately wanted to. Meanwhile, actual nutrition science was more complicated. Not all fats are bad. Unsaturated fats from nuts, avocados and fish are incredibly healthy. And not all low-fat foods are good, most are nutritional disasters, but nuance doesn't sell. Fat-free sells. So that's what companies pushed, and that's what America ate. Even dairy got destroyed. Skim milk, once considered a byproduct, became the healthy option, despite being watery, tasteless, and lacking the fat-soluble vitamins found in whole milk. Cheese went from real dairy to processed fat-free slices that didn't melt and tasted like plastic. Butter was replaced with margarine, which was loaded, with trans fats, ironically far worse for your heart than butter ever was. By the late 1980s, the results were undeniable. Americans were eating more fat-free foods than ever, and they were getting fatter. Obesity rates didn't decline, they skyrocketed. Type 2 diabetes began appearing in younger populations. Heart disease remained rampant. The fat-free craze wasn't working because it was never based on sound science. It was based on marketing. And the worst part? It taught an entire generation to fear real food. Butter, eggs, nuts, avocados, all vilified because they contained fat. Meanwhile, people gorged on fat-free cookies, convinced they were making the healthy choice. The diet food trap didn't just fail, it made everything worse. Packaging isn't just about protection, it's about seduction. In the 1980s, food companies invested millions in package design, testing colours, fonts, and imagery to trigger subconscious responses. Red and yellow stimulated appetite. Shiny foil suggested freshness. Pictures of happy families implied wholesomeness. Even the crinkle of the bag was engineered to sound satisfying. You weren't just buying food, you were buying a feeling wrapped in plastic. Let's talk about walking down a grocery store aisle in 1985. You're surrounded by thousands of products, all screaming for your attention. How do companies make sure you reach for their product and not the competitors sitting right next to it? They study your brain, literally. Food companies hired psychologists, market researchers, and even neuroscientists to understand what makes people stop, look, and buy. Colour was the first weapon. Studies showed that red and yellow triggered hunger and excitement. That's why so many food packages, especially chips, crackers, and fast food, used those colours. McDonald's golden arches, Lay's yellow bag with red logo, Doritos bold red bag, all designed to make your stomach rumble and your hand reach out. Blue, on the other hand, was rarely used because it suppressed appetite. Ever wonder why there aren't many blue foods? Your brain is hardwired to be suspicious of them. Fonts mattered too. Rounded, friendly fonts suggested comfort and nostalgia. Perfect for cookies and cereals aimed at families. Bold, angular fonts suggested strength and energy, ideal for sports drinks and protein bars. Script fonts implied elegance and quality, used for premium products that were often the exact same quality as the cheaper version, but came in fancier packaging. Imagery was carefully calculated. Pictures of whole grains, sun-drenched farms, and smiling farmers implied wholesomeness, even if the product was manufactured in a concrete facility, using ingredients shipped from overseas. Images of happy families gathered around a table suggested that buying this product would bring you closer to your loved ones. Pictures of active, fit people implied that eating this snack would make you energetic and healthy, even if it was nutritionally bankrupt. Even the materials mattered. Shiny foil packaging suggested freshness and premium quality. Matte packaging suggested rustic authenticity. Clear windows that let you see the product inside implied transparency and trustworthiness. We have nothing to hide. Never mind that what you could see was carefully arranged to look better than what you would actually get when you opened it. And then there's the sound. Yes, the sound. Food companies spent thousands of dollars perfecting the crinkle of a chip bag, the snap of a candy bar wrapper, the pop of a soda can. They tested different materials, different thicknesses, different textures, until they found the exact sound that registered as satisfying and exciting in your brain. The sound of opening a package became part of the experience, a Pavlovian trigger that signaled pleasure was coming. The size and shape of packaging was strategic too. Tall and narrow boxes looked like they contained more product than short, wide boxes with the same volume. Bags with lots of air inside made you think you were getting more chips than you actually were. Single-serve packages made portion control feel manageable, even though most people ate 2 or 3 of them. Family-sized packages encouraged bulk buying and bulk eating, and labels were masterpieces of deception. Words like natural, wholesome, homemade, and artisan had no legal definitions but sounded healthy and trustworthy. Made with real fruit meant there might be 2% fruit juice buried in a list of 40 ingredients. No artificial flavours didn't mean it was healthy. It just meant the chemicals they used were derived from natural sources, which could still be heavily processed and unhealthy. Health claims were plastered everywhere, often misleading. Low cholesterol on a bag of chips was meaningless. Chips never had cholesterol because cholesterol only comes from animal products. But it sounded healthy, so people bought it. Fortified, with vitamins made sugary cereal seem nutritious. Heart healthy appeared on products that were anything but. Even the placement in stores was psychological warfare. Eye-level shelves held the most profitable products, the ones companies paid extra to position there. The bottom shelves held cheaper, often healthier options that companies didn't want you to notice. End caps, those displays at the end of aisles, were prime real estate, reserved for products companies were pushing hard, often because they were launching something new or needed to move excess inventory. And let's not forget the checkout aisle, the final gauntlet. After you'd successfully navigated the entire store without impulse buying, you had to stand in line surrounded by candy bars, gum, magazines, and cold sodas. The products were positioned at both adult and child eye level, ensuring that someone in your family would beg for something. It was a last chance trap, and it worked brilliantly. By the end of the 1980s, packaging had become a science more precise than the food inside it. You weren't just buying a product, you were buying into a carefully constructed fantasy, a promise, a feeling. And food companies had mastered the art of making you feel like you needed it before you even knew what it was. Food scientists discovered that texture is as important as taste, sometimes more so. A perfect crunch releases endorphins, signals freshness, and creates a multi-sensory experience. Companies spent years perfecting the crunch in chips, the snap of a candy bar, the crisp of a cracker. They tested decibel levels, hired acoustic engineers, and calibrated breakage points. Every bite was designed to feel as good as it tasted. Close your eyes and imagine biting into a perfectly crispy chip. That satisfying crunch, the way it shatters in your mouth, the sound it makes as you chew. It's more than just eating, it's an experience. And in the 1980s, food scientists figured out that the crunch might be even more important than the flavour. Studies show that texture affects satiety, enjoyment, and even how much people eat. A crunchy food feels more satisfying than a soft one, even if they have the same calories. The act of chewing something crispy takes effort, and that effort tricks your brain into thinking you've eaten something substantial. Plus, the sound of crunching is inherently pleasurable. It signals freshness, quality, and indulgence. So companies got to work. They hired acoustic engineers, actual sound specialists, to measure the decibel level of the perfect crunch. They discovered that a chip should produce a sound between 63 and 75 decibels to register as optimally satisfying. Too quiet, and it felt stale. Too loud, and it was unpleasant. They tested thousands of variations, adjusting thickness, oil content, and frying time until they hit the sweet spot. Frito-Lay became obsessed with crunch science. They built labs where researchers sat in soundproof rooms with microphones, recording the exact noise a chip made when bitten. They analysed waveforms, studied frequency patterns, and even measured how crunch changed as a chip went stale. The goal wasn't just to make chips taste good, it was to make them sound good. And it wasn't just chips. Breakfast cereals were engineered for maximum crunch in milk. Kellogg's and General Mills spent millions ensuring that their cereals stayed crispy for at least 3 minutes after milk was poured, long enough to finish a bowl without it turning to mush. They tested different grain structures, coatings and baking methods. The crunch had to be loud enough to hear, but not so hard it hurt your teeth. Candy bars got the same treatment. The snap of a Kit Kat, the crunch of a Butterfinger, the crisp shell of an M&M, all engineered. The snap of breaking a Kit Kat in half became iconic, so much so that they used the sound in commercials. It was satisfying in a primal way, and people began associating that sound with pleasure, reward, and indulgence. Crackers were another battleground. Ritz, Wheat Thins, Triscuits, each one designed for a specific type of crunch. Ritz was flaky and delicate, shattering easily. Wheat Thins were crisp and sharp. Triscuits were hearty and substantial. The differences weren't accidental, they were calibrated to appeal to different preferences and eating occasions. Even texture layering became a science. A perfect snack combined multiple textures: crunchy exterior, creamy filling, chewy center. Think Oreos, the snap of the cookie, the smooth cream inside. Or Snickers, the crunch of peanuts, the chew of caramel, the snap of chocolate. Each element played a role, and the combination was more satisfying than any single texture alone. But texture wasn't just about pleasure, it was about quantity. Crunchy foods encourage faster eating. The rhythm of crunch, chew, swallow creates a pace that's hard to interrupt. Before you know it, you've eaten half the bag. Soft, slow-to-chew foods give your brain time to register fullness. Crunchy foods bypass that signal entirely. Food scientists also discovered that people eat more from noisy foods. The act of crunching provides feedback, a sensory loop that keeps you engaged and reaching for more. It's why you can polish off an entire bag of chips in one sitting but struggle to finish a bowl of oatmeal. The crunch is entertainment, distraction, and reward all at once, and crunch signals freshness in a way that nothing else does. A soft chip is a failure, a sign of staleness, poor storage, or age. A crunchy chip is success. Companies knew this and designed packaging that preserved crunch as long as possible. Foil bags, resealable zippers, nitrogen-flushed interiors. Every innovation was about maintaining that perfect sound and texture from factory to your mouth. By the end of the 1980s, texture had become as important as flavour, maybe more so. People chose snacks based on how they felt in their mouths, how they sounded when bitten, how satisfying the physical act of eating them was. Food wasn't just fuel or even taste. It was a full-body sensory experience, engineered to perfection. Natural strawberry flavour requires strawberries. Artificial strawberry flavour requires a laboratory and about 40 chemicals. In the 1980s, food companies perfected the art of faking nature. Why use real vanilla when vanillin is cheaper? Why use real fruit when esters and aldehydes can mimic the taste? Artificial flavours allowed companies to mass-produce fruit snacks, cheese crackers, and butter popcorn without ever touching the real thing. And consumers couldn't tell the difference until their bodies started keeping score. Let's start with the truth. Almost nothing in processed food tastes like what it claims to be. That strawberry yogurt? No strawberries. That butter-flavoured popcorn? No butter. That vanilla ice cream? Probably no vanilla beans. Instead, you're eating a cocktail of chemicals designed to trick your brain into thinking it's the real thing. In the 1980s, flavor chemistry exploded. Scientists learned that taste isn't a single thing. It's a combination of volatile compounds that hit your nose and tongue in specific patterns. A strawberry, for example, has over 360 distinct chemical compounds that contribute to its flavor. But food scientists discovered they didn't need all 360. They could isolate 5 or 6 key compounds, synthesize them in a lab, and create something that tasted strawberry adjacent, close enough that most people wouldn't notice, and artificial flavors were cheap. Incredibly cheap. A pound of real vanilla beans cost hundreds of dollars and required months of labor-intensive farming and curing. A pound of vanillin, the primary compound in vanilla, could be synthesized from petrochemicals or wood pulp for a few dollars. Same general taste, fraction of the cost. For food companies, the choice was obvious. Fruit flavors were even easier to fake. Banana flavor came from a single compound called isoamyl acetate. Grape flavor came from methylanthranilate. Cherry flavor came from benzaldehyde, which could be derived from almonds or synthesized in a lab. None of it required actual fruit, and all of it was shelf-stable, consistent, and scalable. But here's the trick. Artificial flavors don't just mimic nature, they amplify it. Real strawberries taste complex, subtle, slightly different every time. Artificial strawberry flavor is a hyper-real version, intensified and simplified, designed to hit your taste buds harder than the real thing ever could. It's strawberryness without the strawberry, and your brain, used to natural variation, finds the consistency and intensity addictive. Butter flavor was another triumph of chemistry. Real butter is a complex mixture of fats, proteins, and aromatic compounds. But the compound that makes butter taste buttery is diacetyl, a simple chemical that can be produced in a lab. Add diacetyl to popcorn oil and suddenly it tastes buttery without any dairy. Movie theaters loved it. Popcorn manufacturers loved it. Consumers loved it, until they learned that inhaling diacetyl vapor in factory settings was causing severe lung disease in workers. But in food, still approved. And cheese flavor? Forget actual cheese. That's a combination of lactic acid, butyric acid, salt, and various fermentation byproducts synthesized in a lab. The result tastes cheesy enough that most people never question it, even though it's never been near a cow. The scary part is that natural flavors aren't much better. Legally, a natural flavor just means it was derived from something that was once alive, a plant, animal, or microbe. But it's still processed, isolated, and often chemically identical to artificial flavors. Natural vanilla flavor might come from beaver anal glands. Seriously, look up castoreum. Natural strawberry flavor might be made from fungus grown in a lab. Natural doesn't mean whole, unprocessed, or recognizable. Food companies loved artificial flavors because they solved a major problem: consistency. Real ingredients vary. One batch of strawberries tastes different from another. Weather, soil, season, all of it affects flavor. But artificial flavors are identical every single time. That bag of strawberry candy tastes the same whether you buy it in Maine or California, in January or July. For a corporation trying to build brand loyalty, that consistency is gold. But there's a cost. When you eat artificial flavors regularly, your palate adjusts. Real food starts tasting dull. A fresh strawberry can't compete with strawberry candy because the candy is engineered to be more intense. Real cheese tastes boring compared to neon orange cheese dust. Natural vanilla seems bland next to artificial vanilla, which is cranked up to maximum vanillin concentration. And your body knows the difference, even if your taste buds don't. Real food contains fiber, vitamins, antioxidants, and compounds we're still discovering. Artificial flavors contain chemicals that taste like food. Your brain gets the flavor signal, but your body doesn't get the nutrition, so you eat more, searching for satisfaction that never comes. By the end of the 1980s, artificial flavours were in everything: candy, soda, cereal, snacks, frozen dinners, desserts, condiments. Most people had no idea they were eating fake flavours because the label said natural and artificial flavours, a vague phrase that meant nothing. And even when people knew, they didn't care because it tasted good and cost less. Faking nature had become so normalised that an entire generation grew up without knowing what real food was supposed to taste like. The snack aisle used to be small, a shelf or two of chips and cookies. By the late 1980s, it had exploded into entire aisles of endless variety. Baked, fried, cheese-flavoured, ranch-dusted, barbecue-blasted, sweet, savoury, crunchy, chewy. Choice became overwhelming, but that was the point. The more options, the more reasons to buy. Every trip to the grocery store became a minefield of temptation, engineered to make you leave with far more than you intended. Walk into any grocery store in 1980, and the snack section was modest. A few brands, a few flavours, nothing overwhelming. Walk into that same store in 1989, and you'd need a map. The snack aisle had become a cathedral of processed food, towering shelves packed with hundreds of options, each one screaming for your attention. This wasn't accidental. Food companies discovered that variety drives sales. If you offer someone 3 flavours of chips, they'll pick one. If you offer 20 flavours, they'll buy 2 or 3 because they can't decide and don't want to miss out. It's called the paradox of choice, and grocery stores weaponized it. Lay's led the charge. In the early 1980s, they had maybe 5 flavours: original, barbecue, sour cream and onion, and a couple of others. By 1989, they had dozens: ranch, cheddar, salt and vinegar, jalapeno, mesquite, pizza-flavoured, even dill pickle. Some flavours were regional exclusives, creating FOMO, fear of missing out, before that was even a term. People travelled to other states just to try flavours they couldn't get at home, and it wasn't just chips. Cookies exploded in variety. Oreos, once a simple chocolate sandwich cookie, spawned double stuff. Then flavoured versions, mint, peanut butter, eventually hundreds of limited edition flavours. Nabisco realised that people would buy Oreos they already owned just to try a new flavour. Collectors started hoarding them. The cookie aisle became a battleground of innovation and absurdity. Crackers, granola bars, popcorn, pretzels, every category expanded exponentially. You could buy pretzels in 20 shapes and 10 flavours. Popcorn came, buttered, kettle corn, cheese, caramel, mixed. Granola bars came chewy, crunchy, chocolate-dipped, yogurt-covered, stuffed with filling. The variety was dizzying, and companies started creating hybrid products, snacks that combined 2 things people loved: peanut butter-filled pretzels, cheese-stuffed crackers, cookies with candy pieces inside. Every combination was tested, and if it sold, it stayed. Innovation was relentless because shelf space was limited, and if your product didn't sell, it got replaced by a competitor's. The snack aisle became a psychological battlefield. Bright packaging fought for your attention. Limited edition labels created urgency: buy it now or miss out forever. New banners signalled innovation, even if the product was just repackaged. Family size and party size normalised buying massive quantities. Single-serve bags suggested portion control, but were designed to be eaten in one sitting and still leave you wanting more, and placement mattered. Companies paid. Grocery stores for premium shelf space, eye level, end caps near the checkout. The best-selling products weren't necessarily the best. They were the most visible. If you saw something 10 times during your shopping trip, your brain started craving it, even if you'd never tried it before. Repetition breeds desire. Food companies also started targeting specific demographics with precision. Snacks for kids, snacks for athletes, snacks for dieters, snacks for late-night cravers, snacks for office workers, snacks for road trips. Every niche got its own product, its own marketing, its own shelf space, and people bought into it, believing that they needed different snacks for different occasions. The explosion of variety also created decision fatigue. When faced with too many choices, people often make impulsive decisions or buy more than they intended just to simplify the process. Grocery stores knew this and designed aisles to maximize overwhelm. The longer you stood there staring at options, the more likely you were to grab multiple products out of frustration. And limited edition flavors became a phenomenon. Companies would release a flavor for a few months, then discontinue it. Fans would panic, stockpile, and beg for it to come back. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But the scarcity drove obsession. People hunted down rare flavors like they were collector's items. Online communities formed around snack trading, with people shipping regional exclusives across the country. By the end of the 1980s, the snack aisle wasn't just a place to buy food, it was an experience, a culture, an identity. What snacks you ate said something about who you were. Cool Ranch Doritos versus Nacho Cheese, Chewy Chips Ahoy versus Crunchy, Pepsi versus Coke. Your choices were personal, tribal, almost political, and food companies loved it. Every new flavor was a new chance to hook you. Every aisle was a new opportunity to make you spend. The snack aisle revolution wasn't about feeding people. It was about capturing their wallets, their cravings, and their loyalty, one bag at a time. In the 1980s, fast food chains and packaged food companies joined forces. McDonald's Happy Meals, Pizza Hut's Book It program, Taco Bell's tie-ins with Doritos, brand partnerships blurred the lines between restaurant and grocery store. Kids who loved Happy Meal toys became adults who craved Big Macs. Loyalty started young, and it lasted a lifetime. The partnerships weren't just marketing, they were indoctrination. Fast food had always been about speed and convenience, but in the 1980s it became about something more: branding, lifestyle, and loyalty that started in childhood. Food companies realized that if they could hook kids early, they'd have customers for life. And the best way to hook kids? Make eating fun, collectible, and irresistible. McDonald's perfected this with the Happy Meal, introduced in 1979 but exploding in popularity throughout the 1980s. The food was secondary. Burgers, fries, nuggets, nothing revolutionary. The toy was everything. Kids didn't beg to go to McDonald's because they were hungry. They begged because they wanted the toy, the prize, the collectible. And McDonald's rotated toys constantly, partnering with Disney, Mattel, and other major brands. One month it was Hot Wheels, the next it was Barbie, then Transformers, then My Little Pony. Every visit was a chance to complete a set, and kids are completionists by nature. Parents found themselves driving to McDonald's multiple times a week, not because their child wanted food, but because their child needed toy number 4 to complete the series. It was brilliant, ruthless, and wildly effective. McDonald's wasn't selling meals, they were selling experiences, memories, and lifelong brand loyalty. A child who associated McDonald's with happiness, fun, and rewards would grow into an adult who craved it during stressful times, celebrated with it, and fed it to their own children. The cycle was self-perpetuating. Pizza Hut took a different approach with their Book It program, launched in 1984. The premise was simple. Kids who read a certain number of books each month earned a free personal pan pizza. On the surface, it was wholesome, encouraging literacy while rewarding kids with food. But underneath, it was brand indoctrination. Kids associated Pizza Hut with achievement, with success, with being a good student. Teachers participated, parents praised it, and schools promoted it. And every time a child earned their pizza, they walked into a Pizza Hut restaurant, surrounded by the smells, the atmosphere, the other menu items. Maybe their parents ordered a pizza too. Maybe they got breadsticks or dessert. The free personal pan was the gateway, but the upsell was the profit. And decades later, adults who participated in Book It, as kids remembered it fondly, nostalgically, they took their own kids to Pizza Hut because it reminded them of their childhood. Pizza Hut didn't just create customers, they created generational loyalty. Taco Bell eventually partnered with Doritos, creating the Doritos Locos Taco, a taco shell made from Doritos chips. It was a mashup that blurred the lines between grocery store snack and fast food meal. The campaign was a massive success, generating billions in sales and showing that brand partnerships could go beyond toys and prizes. They could literally become the product. Fast food chains also partnered with movie studios, releasing limited edition meals tied to blockbuster films. Star Wars, Batman, Indiana Jones, every major release came with branded cups, collectible toys, and themed meals. Kids dragged their parents to the theatre, then to the fast food restaurant, then back again to collect more toys. It was a cross-promotional machine designed to extract maximum spending from families. And let's not forget cereal collaborations. Fast food chains released their own breakfast cereals, McDonald's had McDonald's cereal, and Burger King had its own version. They tasted like sugar with a hint of branding, but kids loved them because they felt like eating their favourite restaurant for breakfast. It was marketing genius. Turn your restaurant into a grocery product, invade the home, and occupy more real estate in the consumer's life. But the most insidious part of these partnerships was how they normalized fast food as a regular part of life. It wasn't a treat anymore, it was expected. Kids had Happy Meals after soccer practice, Pizza Hut for reading achievements, Taco Bell after school. Fast food became woven into the rhythm of childhood, and by the time those kids grew up, eating it felt as natural as breathing. Brand loyalty wasn't just about preference, it was about identity. You were a McDonald's kid or a Burger King kid. You liked Pizza Hut or Domino's. These weren't trivial choices, they were tribal. And food. Companies knew that tribal loyalty was the most powerful kind. By the end of the 1980s, fast food had infiltrated every corner of American life, schools, homes, celebrations, rewards, and memories. The partnerships between fast food chains and packaged food brands created an ecosystem of cravings, where every experience was tied to a product and every product was tied to a lifelong customer. Lunchables hit shelves in 1988 and changed school lunches forever. Suddenly, kids weren't eating sandwiches, they were assembling mini pizzas from prepackaged components. Parents loved the convenience, kids loved the control, food companies loved the profits. But nutritionally, Lunchables were a disaster, high in sodium, low in nutrients, engineered purely for taste and shelf life. Yet they became iconic, a symbol of 1980s food culture where convenience trumped health every single time. Before Lunchables, packing a school lunch was a chore. You made a sandwich, tossed in some fruit, maybe a juice box and called it done. It was wholesome, relatively healthy, and boring as hell. Kids traded lunches, complained, and often threw half of it away. Parents were exhausted, and food companies saw an opportunity. Oscar Mayer, facing declining Bologna sales, needed a hit. They brainstormed ways to make lunch more exciting, more interactive, and most importantly, more profitable. The answer was Lunchables, a plastic tray divided into compartments, each filled with crackers, processed meat, cheese, and sometimes a dessert or drink. The twist? Kids assembled it themselves. This was revolutionary. Instead of opening a boring sandwich, kids became chefs, stacking meat and cheese on crackers like tiny architects. It gave them control, creativity, and a sense of accomplishment. And because it came pre-packaged, parents didn't have to do anything except toss it in the lunchbox. It was convenience wrapped in empowerment, and both kids and parents loved it. The marketing was brilliant. Commercials showed kids proudly making their own lunches while parents smiled approvingly in the background. It positioned Lunchables as independence training, a way for kids to take responsibility. Never mind that they were eating processed meat products, cheese-like slices, and crackers made from refined flour. It felt like a win. And kids became obsessed. Lunchables were cool. They were fun. They were collectible. Different varieties meant different experiences. You could get pizza Lunchables, nachos, sub-sandwiches, even dessert versions. Trading Lunchables became social currency. The kid with the rare flavour was the hero of the cafeteria. But nutritionally, Lunchables were a train wreck. A single tray could contain over 1,000 milligrams of sodium, nearly half the daily recommended intake for an adult, let alone a child. The meat was heavily processed, loaded with preservatives and nitrates. The cheese wasn't real cheese, it was a cheese product filled with emulsifiers and stabilizers. The crackers were refined carbs with zero fiber, and the fruit punch was sugar water with artificial flavoring. But none of that mattered because Lunchables tasted good. The combination of salt, fat, and processed flavors hit all the right pleasure buttons. Kids didn't care about nutrition labels. They cared about the Capri Sun, the Reese's Cup, the Airheads candy tucked into the package. Lunchables were a party in a box, and parents felt good about it because it seemed balanced. There was meat, protein, cheese, calcium, crackers, grains, and sometimes fruit, vitamins. The packaging implied nutrition, even if the reality was closer to a gas station snack than a meal. The word lunch right there in the name made it feel legitimate. Oscar Mayer knew exactly what they were doing. They tested hundreds of combinations, measuring which ones kids ate fastest, which ones generated the most positive feedback, which ones parents felt least guilty buying. They optimized every component for maximum craveability and minimum cost. Lunchables were cheap to produce, pennies per unit, but sold for several dollars. The profit margins were enormous, and once Lunchables dominated the market, competitors rushed in. Armour launched lunch makers. Hilscher Farms tried their own version, but Oscar Mayer had captured the culture, and Lunchables became synonymous with packaged lunch. Just like Kleenex and Band-Aid, Lunchables became the generic term for any prepackaged lunch kit. Schools tried to fight back. Some banned Lunchables outright, citing nutrition concerns. Others sent letters home encouraging parents to pack healthier lunches, but parents were exhausted, working longer hours, juggling more responsibilities. Lunchables were easy, and easy won. By the end of the 1980s, Lunchables had fundamentally changed what lunch meant for American kids. It wasn't a meal anymore, it was an experience, a toy, a status symbol. And an entire generation grew up believing that lunch came in a plastic tray, that assembling food was the same as cooking it, and that convenience was more important than nutrition. Lunchables weren't just a product, they were a philosophy, and that philosophy said, faster is better, fun matters more than health, and if it's packaged, it's progress. Soda consumption in the 1980s reached staggering heights. Coca-Cola and Pepsi waged war for market dominance, flooding the airwaves with celebrity endorsements and catchy jingles. Soda wasn't just a drink, it was a lifestyle. Vending machines appeared in schools, supersized cups became the norm, and with the introduction of high fructose corn syrup, soda became cheaper and sweeter than ever. Americans drank it by the gallon, unaware they were sipping their way toward a diabetes epidemic. In the 1980s, soda wasn't just popular, it was everywhere. You couldn't escape it. Gas stations, movie theatres, schools, offices, vending machines on every corner. Coca-Cola and Pepsi weren't just selling beverages, they were selling identity, belonging, and happiness in a can. The rivalry between Coke and Pepsi reached fever pitch. They launched the Cola Wars, a marketing battle so intense it became part of pop culture. Pepsi recruited Michael Jackson, the biggest star on the planet, and aired commercials during the Super Bowl. Coke responded by doubling down on nostalgia and Americana, positioning themselves as the classic, timeless choice. Then came New Coke in 1985, one of the biggest marketing disasters in history. Coca-Cola, spooked by Pepsi's rising market share, reformulated their flagship product to taste sweeter, more like Pepsi. The backlash was instant and furious. People hoarded cases of old Coke. Protests erupted. Within months, Coca-Cola brought back the original formula as Coca-Cola Classic, and sales skyrocketed. Some conspiracy theorists even suggest the whole thing was a publicity stunt. Either way, it worked. Coke dominated headlines and regained market share. But beyond the marketing battles, something darker was happening. Soda consumption was exploding, and it wasn't just adults drinking it. Kids were guzzling it daily. Vending machines started appearing in schools, funded by exclusive contracts, where schools received kickbacks in exchange for allowing soda companies access to students. Schools needed money for programs, and soda companies needed customers. It was a deal with the devil, disguised as fundraising. And portion sizes grew absurdly large. In the 1950s, a standard soda was 6.5 ounces. By the 1980s, a small was 12 ounces, a medium was 20, and a large was 32 or more. 7-Eleven introduced the Big Gulp in 1980, a 32-ounce cup of soda that seemed comically oversized at the time. But it was just the beginning. Soon came the Super Big Gulp, 44 ounces, and eventually the Double Gulp, 64 ounces. That's half a gallon of soda in one sitting, and people drank it. Not because they were thirsty, because it was there, it was cheap, and it was normalized. Soda became the default beverage. Water was boring. Milk was for kids. Juice was expensive. Soda was everything. Sweet, caffeinated, fizzy, fun. It was refreshment, energy, and reward all in one can. High fructose corn syrup made it cheaper than ever. Soda companies could produce massive quantities at rock-bottom prices, which meant they could supersize without losing profit. A 32-ounce soda cost them maybe 10 cents more than a 12-ounce, but they could charge $1 extra. The margins were incredible, but the health consequences were catastrophic. A single 20-ounce bottle of soda contained 65 grams of sugar, more than twice the daily recommended limit. A Big Gulp contained over 90 grams. And people weren't having one soda, they were having 2, 3, sometimes more in a single day. The sugar didn't just add empty calories. It spiked blood sugar, crashed energy levels, and created a craving cycle that mimicked addiction. Your body metabolized the fructose in the liver, which over time contributed to insulin resistance, fatty liver disease, and type 2 diabetes. But in the 1980s, most people didn't know that. They just knew soda tasted good and gave them a quick boost. Caffeine was the other hook. Coke, Pepsi, Mountain Dew, all loaded with caffeine. Kids who started drinking soda young became dependent on the caffeine without realizing it. They'd feel sluggish without it, reach for another can, and the cycle continued. It wasn't addiction in the clinical sense, but it was close enough. And soda companies marketed it as essential to every occasion. Soda with pizza, soda with popcorn, soda at parties, soda at barbecues, soda after sports, soda to relax, soda to celebrate. Every moment of life had a soda-shaped hole, and companies made sure you knew it. By the end of the 1980s, the average American was drinking more than 40 gallons of soda per year. That's over 500 cans. And kids were drinking even more. Soda had replaced milk as the most consumed beverage among children. An entire generation was being raised on liquid candy, and nobody seemed to notice or care. Soda wasn't just a drink. It was a cultural force, an economic powerhouse, and a public health disaster waiting to explode. Frozen dinners promised freedom from the kitchen. Swanson TV dinners, Stufa's lasagna, Hot Pockets, all marketed as quick, easy, and delicious. In reality, they were loaded with sodium, preservatives, and mystery ingredients. But in the 1980s, microwaves were the future, and frozen food was the fuel. Families gathered around the TV with trays on their laps, and no one questioned what was actually in the food. Convenience had won. The microwave oven became a household staple in the 1980s, and with it came a revolution in how Americans ate. No longer did you need to cook, just pop a tray in the microwave, wait 3 minutes, and boom, dinner. It was fast, it was easy, and it tasted fine. Good enough, better than nothing, and in a decade defined by dual-income households and packed schedules, good enough was a victory. Swanson had been selling TV dinners since the 1950s, but they truly exploded in the 1980s. The name said it all. These weren't meals. They were companions for television watching. You ate them on the couch, in front of the screen, often alone. The social aspect of dining disappeared, replaced by individual trays and personal entertainment, and the variety expanded rapidly. Salisbury steak, turkey with gravy, fried chicken, meatloaf, lasagna, enchiladas. There was something for everyone. Manufacturers even created gourmet frozen meals like Lean Cuisine and Healthy Choice, targeting health-conscious consumers who wanted convenience without the guilt. Spoiler, they were still loaded with sodium and preservatives, just with fewer calories. But let's talk about what was actually in these dinners. The meat was processed beyond recognition, mechanically separated, restructured, held together with binders and fillers. The vegetables were mushy, flavourless, often just there for colour. The sauces were thickened with starches and loaded with salt to compensate for the lack of real flavour. And everything was preserved with chemicals designed to keep it edible for months or years. A single frozen dinner could contain 1,500 milligrams of sodium or more, nearly an entire day's worth in one meal. Why so much salt? Because frozen food loses flavour during the freezing process, and salt is the cheapest way to make it taste like something. It also acts as a preservative, extending shelf life even further, and the portions were deceptive. A frozen dinner looked substantial in the package, but once heated, it shrank. The vegetables were mostly ice, the meat was thin, the pasta was sparse. You'd finish the tray and still be hungry, reaching for snacks an hour later. But people loved them because they solved real problems. After a long day at work, nobody wanted to cook. Frozen dinners meant no chopping, no stirring, no dishes. Just peel back the film, microwave, and eat. For busy parents, exhausted workers, and anyone who hated cooking, frozen dinners were a lifesaver. Hot Pockets, introduced in 1983, took it even further. They weren't just a meal, they were portable. You could eat them on the go, in the car, at your desk. No plate, no fork, just a napkin and a high tolerance for molten lava filling that burned your mouth every single time. And like everything else in the 1980s, frozen food became a status symbol. Having a freezer stocked with variety meant you were modern, busy, successful. Home cooking felt old-fashioned, inefficient, a waste of time. Why spend an hour making dinner when you could have it ready in 3 minutes? By the end of the decade, frozen food had become the norm. Home-cooked meals were the exception, something reserved for special occasions or weekends. Convenience had won and nutrition had lost. But nobody cared, because dinner was ready, and that's all that mattered. Before launching a new product, food companies tested it on focus groups, carefully selected consumers who tasted, critiqued, and rated prototypes. Companies learned exactly what people wanted: more salt, more crunch, more sweetness. They adjusted formulas based on feedback, creating products engineered to score a perfect 10 in taste tests. But focus groups didn't measure long-term health effects. They measured immediate satisfaction, and that's exactly what companies delivered. Food companies didn't guess what people wanted. They measured it with scientific precision. Focus groups were the secret weapon of the processed food industry, the place where products were born, refined, and perfected before ever hitting shelves. Here's how it worked. Companies recruited everyday people, parents, kids, teenagers, office workers, and brought them into testing facilities. They'd sit in rooms with two-way mirrors, tasting products while researchers watched and recorded every reaction. Facial expressions, how quickly they reached for more, whether they finished the sample, what they said, what they didn't say, all of it was data. And companies tested everything. Different salt levels, sugar concentrations, fat content, crunch, texture, colour, smell. They'd present participants with 5 versions of the same chip, each one slightly different, and ask which they preferred. Then they'd adjust the formula and test again, and again, and again, until they found the version that scored highest on every metric. But focus groups weren't just about taste, they were about cravings. Researchers didn't ask, "Do you like this?" They asked, "Would you buy this again? How soon? How often?" They measured desire, not just preference. They wanted products that people couldn't resist, couldn't stop thinking about, couldn't wait to buy again. And they learned that people wanted extremes, not balanced flavours, but bold, intense, exaggerated ones. More salt than seemed reasonable, more sugar than should be legal, more cheese dust than made sense. Natural flavours were boring. Engineered flavours were exciting, and exciting sold. Focus groups also revealed the power of texture. A chip that was too soft scored low, a chip that was too hard scored low, but a chip with the perfect crunch, the ideal breakage point, the right amount of residual powder on the fingers, that scored off the charts. Texture wasn't just a detail, it was the product. And companies tested packaging too. They'd show participants different designs and track which ones made them more likely to buy. Bright colours? Yes. Pictures of the food? Yes. Health claims? Sometimes. Cartoon characters? Absolutely. Especially for kids. Every element was tested, measured and optimised. But here's the dark side. Focus groups never measured long-term health effects. They didn't ask, "Will eating this every day for a year make you sick?" They asked, "Do you want more right now?" Immediate satisfaction was the only metric that mattered, and companies designed products to maximise it. Consequences be damned. By the end of the 1980s, nearly every major processed food product on shelves had been through dozens of focus groups, refined and perfected into something scientifically engineered to be irresistible. And it worked. People ate more, bought more, and craved more, never realizing they were consuming products designed in laboratories to override their better judgment. Food addiction works like any other addiction: trigger, craving, reward, repeat. In the 1980s, companies perfected this loop. Bright packaging triggered attention. The bliss point triggered cravings. The crunch and flavour delivered the reward. And the loop started over. The more you ate, the more you wanted. It wasn't willpower, it was biochemistry. And companies knew exactly what they were doing. Let's talk about what happens in your brain when you eat a Dorito. First, your eyes see the bright red bag. Instant recognition, instant interest. Your brain remembers that bag means pleasure. Before you've even opened it, dopamine starts flowing in anticipation. That's the trigger. You open the bag, the smell hits you, artificial cheese, salt, corn. Your mouth starts watering involuntarily. You haven't tasted anything yet, but your brain is already preparing for the reward. You take a bite. The chip crunches perfectly. The cheese dust dissolves on your tongue, flooding it with salt and fat. Your brain lights up like a slot machine hitting a jackpot. Dopamine surges. That's the reward. And here's the trick. The reward isn't quite satisfying enough. It's good, really good, but not complete. So you reach for another chip, and another. Each bite delivers a hit of pleasure but never quite fills the void. You keep eating, chasing a satisfaction that's always one chip away. That's the craving loop, and it's engineered into the product. Food scientists in the 1980s studied addiction, not to prevent it, but to replicate it. They looked at how drugs trigger dopamine release and realized food could do the same thing. Not all food, though. Natural, whole foods don't trigger the same intense response. An apple is nice. A handful of almonds is satisfying, but neither makes you lose control and eat until you're sick. Processed food is different. The combination of sugar, salt, and fat in precise ratios hijacks your brain's reward system. It triggers dopamine release at levels that whole foods can't match. And the more you eat these foods, the more your brain adapts, requiring higher levels to get the same pleasure. You build tolerance just like with drugs. But it's not just the ingredients, it's the experience, the crunch, the texture, the flavor intensity, the convenience, the packaging, the ritual of eating. All of it contributes to the addiction loop. Every element is designed to maximize pleasure and minimize barriers. You don't have to prepare it, plate it, or even think about it. Just open and consume. And companies designed products to keep you in the loop. They avoid what they call sensory-specific satiety, the phenomenon where you get tired of a flavor if it's too strong or too monotonous. Ever notice how you can eat an entire bag of chips but can't finish a plain baked potato? That's because chips are engineered to have a vanishing caloric density. They melt in your mouth quickly, so your brain doesn't register how much you've eaten. The flavor is intense but brief, so you never get sick of it. The loop also works on a macro level. You eat the chips, feel a rush, then crash an hour later. You're hungry again, or more accurately, your brain is craving another dopamine hit. So you reach for more processed food. The cycle continues throughout the day. Breakfast cereal, mid-morning snack, fast food lunch, afternoon candy bar, chips before dinner, dessert after. Each one triggering the same loop. And the worst part? You can't just decide to stop. Willpower doesn't work against biochemistry. When your brain is screaming for dopamine and you're staring at a bag of chips, you're fighting millions of years of evolution that says eat the calorie-dense food. Except in the past, that food was rare. Now it's everywhere, and it's designed to be irresistible. Food companies knew this. They had the research, the data, the brain scans. They knew their products were triggering addiction-like responses, and they didn't care. Or rather, they cared very much because addiction is profitable. An addicted customer is a loyal customer. Someone who craves your product doesn't need convincing to buy it. They just need access. By the end of the 1980s, millions of Americans were caught in the addiction loop, eating not because they were hungry, but because their brains were screaming for another hit. The loop had become so normalized that nobody even called it addiction. They called it snacking, treating, indulging. But the mechanism was the same. Trigger, crave, consume, repeat. And companies made billions keeping people trapped in it. By the late 1980s, American processed food had gone global. McDonald's opened in Moscow. Coca-Cola infiltrated every continent. Doritos, Oreos, and Pop-Tarts spread like wildfire. The world adopted American eating habits, and obesity rates followed. What started as a uniquely American problem became a global epidemic, all thanks to aggressive marketing, irresistible formulas, and the relentless pursuit of profit. In 1990, the first McDonald's opened in Moscow's Pushkin Square, and over 30,000 people lined up on opening day. It wasn't just about burgers, it was about America, capitalism, freedom, and modernity all wrapped in a Big Mac. The Soviet Union was crumbling, and McDonald's represented the future. People waited hours in freezing temperatures just to taste a symbol. But McDonald's was just the tip of the iceberg. Throughout the 1980s, American food companies launched a coordinated invasion of global markets. Coca-Cola had been international for decades, but the 80s saw them double down, aggressively entering new markets with massive marketing campaigns. They sponsored soccer matches in Brazil, cricket in India, festivals in Japan. The goal was simple: make Coke synonymous with celebration, happiness, and modern life everywhere on Earth. PepsiCo followed, not just with soda, but with Frito-Lay products. Doritos landed in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. They adjusted flavors slightly for local tastes: Cool American flavor in Europe instead of Cool Ranch, wasabi in Japan, but the formula remained the same: salt, fat, crunch, addiction. KFC, Pizza Hut, and Burger King spread across continents. They weren't just selling food, they were selling an American lifestyle. For people in developing countries, eating at these restaurants was aspirational, a sign of success and sophistication. Never mind that Americans themselves were suffering from obesity and diet-related diseases. To the rest of the world, American food represented progress. And it worked devastatingly well. Countries that had never struggled with obesity suddenly saw their populations gain weight. China, India, Mexico, Brazil all saw dramatic increases in obesity and diabetes rates as American junk food became normalized. Traditional diets, which had sustained populations for centuries, were abandoned in favor of burgers, fries, and soda. Mexico became the perfect case study. Coca-Cola infiltrated so deeply that in some rural areas, Coke became cheaper and more accessible than clean water. The country's obesity rates skyrocketed and diabetes became epidemic. By the 2010s, Mexico had one of the highest consumption rates of Coca-Cola per capita in the world, and some of the worst health outcomes in the Western Hemisphere. In Asia, fast food became a status symbol. McDonald's in Tokyo, KFC in Beijing, these weren't just restaurants. They were experiences, destinations. Parents took their kids to McDonald's as a treat, not realizing they were establishing habits that would last a lifetime. And American companies poured money into advertising, using the same tactics that had worked in the US. Bright colors, celebrity endorsements, toys, and the promise that eating this food made you modern, happy, and successful. But it wasn't just fast food. Packaged snacks invaded grocery stores worldwide. Oreos in India, Pringles in South Africa, Pop-Tarts in Australia. American food companies partnered with local distributors, adapted products slightly for local tastes, and launched marketing blitzes. The formula was tried and true: engineer the bliss point, create cravings, dominate shelf space, repeat. And governments often welcomed them. American food companies brought jobs, tax revenue, and investment. Politicians cut deals, offered incentives, and looked the other way as public health declined. By the time the health consequences became undeniable, the companies were too entrenched, too powerful, too profitable to stop. The globalization of junk food also created a strange cultural shift. Traditional foods, rice and beans in Latin America, chapati and lentils in India, noodles and vegetables in Asia, became associated with poverty. Fast food and processed snacks became associated with wealth and modernity. Parents who grew up on traditional diets fed their children American junk food because they believed it was better, more nutritious, a sign of upward mobility. And American companies didn't just export their products, they exported their marketing strategies, their portion sizes, their addiction loops. They taught the world to supersize, to snack constantly, to drink soda with every meal. They normalized behaviors that had taken decades to establish in America, compressing the timeline in other countries. By the end of the 1980s and into the 1990s, American junk food wasn't just American anymore, it was global. The same foods that had made Americans sick were now making the world sick. Obesity, diabetes, heart disease, all spreading in lockstep with American food exports. What started in American laboratories and test kitchens had become a worldwide epidemic, and there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. As processed food became cheaper and more convenient, home cooking declined. Why chop vegetables when you could microwave a meal? Why bake cookies when you could buy a package? The 1980s marked the beginning of a cultural shift where cooking became optional, even outdated. Families spent less time in the kitchen and more time in front of screens, and food companies cheered because every homemade meal was a lost sale. There was a time, not long before the 1980s, when cooking was simply what you did. You didn't question it. Dinner meant someone, usually mom, spent an hour or more in the kitchen, chopping, stirring, seasoning and plating. Meals were made from ingredients, not packages. But by the mid-1980s, that was changing fast. This shift happened gradually, then all at once. First came convenience products that saved a little time, boxed cake mix instead of baking from scratch, canned soup instead of homemade stock. Then came frozen vegetables, which were actually a decent innovation, nutritious and convenient. But then came the complete meals, the TV dinners, the instant everything, and suddenly, cooking from scratch started to feel unnecessary, even quaint. Women entering the workforce in larger numbers played a huge role. This wasn't about laziness, it was about survival. When both parents work full-time, coming home to spend 2 hours making dinner isn't realistic. Food companies understood this and positioned their products as liberation, as feminism, as progress. Why should women be chained to the kitchen? Let frozen dinners and boxed meals free you. The messaging was effective, and it wasn't entirely wrong. Convenience did give women more time and more choices, but something was lost in the exchange. Cooking skills that had been passed down through generations started to disappear. Kids who grew up in the 1980s watched their parents microwave dinners instead of cook them. They never learned how to roast a chicken, make a sauce from scratch, or even properly chop an onion. By the time they became adults, cooking felt intimidating, complicated, something only experts did. And food companies reinforced this message. Their advertising implied that cooking from scratch was difficult, time-consuming, and unnecessary. Why struggle when our product is so easy? Just open the box, follow the simple instructions, and you're done. They positioned processed food not as a compromise, but as the smart choice, the modern choice. Cookbook sales declined. Home economics classes in schools were cut or eliminated. The kitchen, once the heart of the home, became just another room, or worse, a storage space for takeout containers. Families stopped eating together at the table. Instead, they ate in front of the TV, each person with their own microwave tray. And once the habit was broken, it was hard to rebuild. If you don't cook regularly, you don't stock a pantry with real ingredients. If you don't have ingredients, you can't cook even if you wanted to. So you buy more processed food, and the cycle continues. Your kitchen becomes decorative, your stove barely used except to boil water for instant ramen. The economic pressure didn't help. Processed food became cheaper than whole. Ingredients, especially when you factored in time. A box of mac and cheese cost $1 and took 7 minutes. Making mac and cheese from scratch cost more, required multiple ingredients, and took 30 minutes. For a family on a budget, the choice was obvious. Fast food filled the gaps. Families started eating out multiple times a week, not as a treat but as routine. Drive-thrus became dinner solutions. Pizza delivery became a regular occurrence. And again, food companies celebrated because every meal eaten away from home was profit in their pockets. Generational knowledge evaporated. Grandmothers who could cook a feast from pantry staples watched their grandchildren struggle to boil pasta. Recipes that had been family treasures for decades were forgotten. The connection between food and culture, between cooking and love, began to fray, and portion sizes at home changed too. When you cooked from scratch, you naturally made reasonable portions. When you microwaved a frozen dinner, you ate whatever was in the package, often far more than a reasonable serving. When you ordered pizza, you ate until it was gone, not until you were full. By the end of the 1980s, home cooking was in decline, and it would only get worse in the decades to come. An entire generation was growing up without learning how to feed themselves with real food. They knew how to open packages, follow microwave instructions, and order delivery, but the actual skill of cooking, the knowledge of how to take raw ingredients and transform them into nourishment, was disappearing. And food companies couldn't have been happier. Every person who didn't cook was a customer for life. Doctors and nutritionists in the 1980s began sounding alarms about processed food, sugar, and obesity. But their warnings were drowned out by billions in advertising. Food companies hired their own scientists, funded favourable studies, and lobbied against regulation. The message to consumers was clear: trust us, not them. And for decades, people did. The evidence was starting to pile up. Studies in the early 1980s linked high sugar consumption to obesity, heart disease, and diabetes. Nutritionists warned that processed food was creating a public health crisis. Doctors saw it in their offices: kids with cavities and weight problems, adults with high blood pressure and early-onset diabetes. The alarms were ringing, but nobody seemed to hear them. Why? Because food companies were louder. For every study warning about sugar, the food industry funded 10 studies downplaying the risks or blaming other factors: lack of exercise, genetics, anything but their products. They hired credible scientists, dressed them in white coats, and put them in front of cameras to assure the public that their products were safe, even beneficial. The Sugar Association, the lobbying arm of the sugar industry, waged a decades-long campaign to shift blame away from sugar and onto fat. They funded research, influenced government dietary guidelines, and convinced the public that fat was the real enemy. This wasn't an accident. Internal documents later revealed it was a coordinated strategy to protect sugar sales, and it worked brilliantly. Food companies also attacked individual critics. When scientists published unfavourable studies, companies launched smear campaigns, questioned their methods, and funded contradictory research. They used the same playbook as the tobacco industry: sow doubt, muddy the waters, and delay regulation as long as possible, and they lobbied hard. Food industry lobbyists flooded Washington, D.C., meeting with lawmakers, funding campaigns, and drafting legislation. When regulations were proposed, like warning labels, advertising restrictions, or limits on sugar content, the industry fought back with armies of lawyers and lobbyists. Most regulations died in committee, watered down to meaninglessness, or were never enforced. Schools were a major battleground. When public health advocates pushed to remove soda machines and junk food from schools, companies countered with two arguments: personal freedom and funding. They framed restrictions as government overreach, an attack on choice, and they reminded cash-strapped schools that those vending machine contracts brought in money for programs and equipment. Schools, desperate for funding, sided with the companies. Parents were caught in the middle. On one side, they had doctors and nutritionists warning about health risks. On the other side, they had advertising, convenience, and kids begging for the foods they saw on TV. And the food company's message was seductive. Everything in moderation. A little treat won't hurt. Don't be so uptight. Live a little. That moderation message was brilliant because it sounded reasonable. Of course moderation is good, but the problem was that processed food was designed to make moderation impossible. When the bliss point triggers cravings and portion sizes keep growing, moderation becomes a myth. But by framing it as a personal responsibility issue, companies shifted blame from their products to consumers. You're not addicted, you just lack willpower. And whenever a health crisis became undeniable, food companies pivoted. When fat was demonized, they made low-fat products. When calories became the concern, they made 100-calorie packs. When sugar came under fire, they used artificial sweeteners. They always stayed one step ahead, reformulating just enough to appear responsive without actually changing anything fundamental. Medical organizations tried to fight back. The American Heart Association issued dietary guidelines. Pediatric associations warned about childhood obesity. But their budgets were minuscule compared to food industry marketing. For every public service announcement about healthy eating, there were 1,000 commercials for junk food, and consumers, overwhelmed with conflicting information, just kept eating what tasted good, what was convenient, what was cheap. The warnings felt abstract. Obesity, diabetes, heart disease were future problems. The pleasure of a Big Mac was immediate. Human brains are wired to prioritize the present, and food companies exploited that ruthlessly. By the end of the 1980s, the battle was essentially over. The food industry had won. Their products were everywhere. Their marketing was ubiquitous. Their political influence was ironclad. The health warnings continued, but they were background noise, easily ignored, while Americans ate themselves toward an epidemic. By the end of the 1980s, the consequences were becoming visible. Obesity rates were climbing. Type 2 diabetes, once rare in children, was appearing in younger and younger patients. Heart disease was epidemic, and much of it traced back to processed food, the sugar, the salt, the fat, the engineering. But food companies didn't slow down. They doubled down, and the addiction epidemic only grew worse. The numbers told a grim story. In 1960, about 13% of American adults were obese. By 1980, it was 15%. By 1990, it was over 22%. The trajectory was clear and accelerating. But it wasn't just adults. Children were getting heavier too. Pediatricians started seeing conditions they'd only read about in textbooks. Kids with high cholesterol, high blood pressure, fatty liver disease, and type 2 diabetes, once called adult onset because children never got it. But they were getting it now. By the late 1980s, endocrinologists were diagnosing type 2 diabetes in teenagers, then preteens, then children as young as 8. The disease, caused primarily by insulin resistance from years of high sugar intake, was showing up in kids who'd been drinking soda and eating processed food their entire short lives. And it wasn't just diabetes. Heart disease rates remained stubbornly high, despite advances in medicine. High blood pressure, once a disease of the elderly, was appearing in younger adults. Strokes were happening earlier, and all of it correlated strongly with diet, specifically the processed food diet that had become the American norm. The human cost was staggering. Families watched loved ones suffer with preventable diseases. Kids were bullied for their weight, struggled with self-esteem, and developed eating disorders. Adults faced discrimination in employment and healthcare. The emotional and psychological toll was as devastating as the physical, and the financial cost was astronomical. Treating obesity-related diseases consumed a growing percentage of healthcare spending. Hospital beds, medications, surgeries, long-term care, all of it costing billions. Insurance premiums rose. Medicare and Medicaid budgets strained. The economic burden of the processed food diet was being paid by everyone, while the profits went to a handful of corporations. But food, companies denied responsibility. They pointed to personal choice, lack of exercise, genetics, anything but their products. They funded studies showing that obese people didn't exercise enough, conveniently ignoring that their products were engineered to be addictive. They suggested that obesity was caused by laziness, not by food that was scientifically designed to override satiety signals. And they attacked the concept of food addiction itself. Their scientists published papers arguing that food couldn't be addictive because everyone has to eat. They claimed the brain scans showing dopamine responses to processed food were meaningless. They insisted that comparing their products to drugs was hysterical and unfair. Meanwhile, the evidence mounted. Studies showed that sugar triggered the same reward pathways as cocaine. MRI scans revealed that obese individuals' brains responded to food images the same way addicts' brains responded to drug cues. Behavioral studies demonstrated that people exhibited withdrawal symptoms when cutting out processed food, irritability, cravings, mood swings, all classic addiction markers. But the food industry had deep pockets and political connections. They funded think tanks that published industry-friendly research. They hired PR firms to craft messaging that shifted blame to individuals. They lobbied against regulations and funded politicians who opposed public health initiatives. And American culture, with its emphasis on personal responsibility and rugged individualism, made it easy to blame individuals rather than systems. If you're fat, it's your fault for not having self-control. Never mind that you're fighting engineered food designed by PhDs to override your self-control. Never mind that healthy food is expensive and processed food is cheap. Never mind that you've been marketed to since childhood, just eat less and exercise more, easy, right? But it wasn't easy. People tried diet after diet, lost weight, gained it back, and blamed themselves for failure. They didn't understand that their biology was working against them, that processed food had altered their metabolism, their gut bacteria, their hunger hormones, and their brain chemistry. They were fighting a war with their own bodies, and the battlefield had been rigged against them from the start. By 1990, the obesity epidemic was undeniable, but the solutions remained elusive. The food that was making people sick was also the cheapest, most convenient, most heavily marketed option. Changing course would require taking on a multi-billion-dollar industry with political clout and cultural momentum. And nobody seemed willing to fight that battle, so the rates kept climbing, the diseases kept spreading, and the food companies kept selling, kept marketing, kept engineering their products to be more irresistible, more profitable, more addictive. The cost was being paid in bodies, in lives, in suffering. But the profits were too good to stop. Some activists and lawmakers tried to fight back, pushing for clearer labels, restrictions on marketing to children, and limits on sugar and sodium. Food companies fought them at every turn, spending millions on lobbying and legal battles. Regulation was slow, weak, and often toothless. The industry had too much power, too much money, and too much influence, and the American diet continued its downward spiral. In the mid-1970s, the Federal Trade Commission tried to ban advertising sugary cereals to children. The logic was sound. Kids can't distinguish ads from entertainment, and marketing junk food to them was manipulative and harmful. Public health advocates rallied behind it. Pediatricians supported it. The science was clear. The food industry responded with overwhelming force. They called it the nanny state trying to control what parents fed their kids. They framed it as an attack on freedom, on capitalism, on the American way. They mobilized parent groups, often industry-funded front organizations, to protest. And they flooded Washington with lobbyists and campaign contributions. The regulation died. Congress, pressured by industry, stripped the FTC of its authority to regulate advertising to children. It was a crushing defeat for public health advocates and a clear message: the food industry was untouchable. Throughout the 1980s, similar battles played out. Proposals for warning labels on sugary drinks defeated. Restrictions on junk food in schools blocked. Limits on sodium in processed food laughed out of committee. Every attempt to regulate was met with industry opposition so fierce, so well-funded, so politically connected that it rarely stood a chance. The industry used a multi-pronged strategy. First, they questioned the science. Even when evidence was overwhelming, they'd find one dissenting researcher, fund their work and amplify their voice. Second, they framed regulations as attacks on freedom and choice. Americans love freedom, and positioning healthy eating initiatives as government overreach was devastatingly effective. Third, they pointed to economic costs, lost jobs, business closures, increased prices, even when those projections were wildly exaggerated. And they weaponized the concept of personal responsibility. Why should the government tell people what to eat? If someone wants to drink a gallon of soda, that's their choice. This message resonated in a culture that valued individualism over collective well-being. Never mind that those choices were being manipulated by billions in marketing, by products engineered to be addictive, by an environment where healthy options were expensive and scarce. Some regulations did pass, but they were often gutted. Nutrition labels were required, but the serving sizes were unrealistic. Half a cookie, a few chips, a third of a muffin. Who eats that way? And the labels themselves were confusing, filled with percentages and technical terms that most people didn't understand. It was compliance theatre, giving the appearance of transparency without actually helping consumers make informed choices. School nutrition programs were another battleground. When Michelle Obama later tried to improve school lunches in the 2000s, the food industry fought to have pizza classified as a vegetable because of the tomato paste. That's how absurd the fights became. But back in the 1980s, schools were signing exclusive contracts with soda companies, installing vending machines, and accepting corporate sponsorship in exchange for access to students. Public health lost, repeatedly. State and local governments tried to act when the federal government wouldn't. Some cities proposed soda taxes, bans on trans fats, or restrictions on restaurant portion sizes. The industry crushed most of these too, arguing that a patchwork of local regulations would be confusing and burdensome. They preferred federal inaction to local action, and the revolving door between industry and government made regulation nearly impossible. FDA officials left to work for food companies. Industry executives were appointed to regulatory positions. Lobbyists drafted legislation that was then introduced by friendly lawmakers. The system was so corrupted that meaningful change was nearly impossible. Consumer advocacy groups did what they could. Organizations like the Center for Science in the Public Interest published reports, filed lawsuits, and organized campaigns. But they were outgunned and outspent by orders of magnitude. For every dollar advocates spent, the industry spent 1,000. And the media, dependent on advertising revenue from food companies, was often reluctant to cover the issue aggressively. Investigative reports were rare. Critical documentaries were buried. The story of how processed food was making America sick was told in whispers, not headlines. By the end of the 1980s, the regulatory landscape was clear. The food industry had won. They'd successfully fought off almost every attempt at meaningful regulation. They'd secured their right to market junk food to children, to fill products with sugar and sodium, to engineer addiction, and to profit from the resulting epidemic. The fight for regulation wasn't over, but the industry had built such a fortress of political power that breaking through seemed almost impossible. So tonight, as you settle into your bed with all the conveniences of modern life, maybe take a moment to think about what we just walked through together. The 1980s weren't ancient history, they were just yesterday. And the choices made in corporate boardrooms and food science laboratories back then are still shaping what you eat, what you crave, and how you feel about food right now. We've traced a story that started with convenience and ended with crisis. Food companies didn't set out to make America sick, they set out to make money. But in the process of engineering the perfect chip, the irresistible cereal, the addictive soda, they fundamentally changed our relationship with food. They took eating, one of the most basic human needs, and turned it into a battlefield where biology fights against billion-dollar manipulation. And here's what's remarkable. The people who built this system weren't villains twirling mustaches. They were scientists, marketers, executives, people doing their jobs, optimizing products, maximizing profits, feeding families. They just happened to be really, really good at it. So good that they rewired a generation's taste buds, normalized portion sizes that would have shocked their grandparents, and created cravings that feel as natural as breathing. The 1980s generation, maybe that's you, maybe that's your parents, they didn't stand a chance. They were kids watching Saturday morning cartoons, and between every episode, they were being programmed. They were teenagers hanging out at convenience stores, not realizing those snacks were engineered to keep them coming back. They were young parents reaching for frozen dinners after long work days, not knowing they were passing down habits that would echo through generations. And the saddest part, they were told it was their fault. When they gained weight, when they got sick, when they couldn't stop eating foods that made them feel terrible, they were told they just needed more willpower, more discipline, more self-control. Nobody told them they were fighting against products designed by PhDs to override their self-control. Nobody told them the game was rigged from the start. But here's the thing about knowing the truth. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You can't look at a bag of chips the same way once you know about the bliss point, about the acoustic engineering, about the cheese dust designed to make you lick your fingers. You can't drink soda without thinking about the high fructose corn syrup and the addiction loops. You can't walk through a grocery store without seeing the manipulation in every brightly coloured package. Knowledge is power, but it's also responsibility. Because now you know. You know why you crave certain foods. You know why moderation feels impossible. You know why your kids beg for the same junk you grew up on. And knowing means you have a choice. Not an easy choice, not a simple choice, but a choice nonetheless. You can keep playing the game by the rules the food industry wrote. Or you can start writing your own rules. Cook a meal from scratch, even if it's imperfect. Buy an apple instead of an apple-flavoured snack. Drink water when your brain screams for soda. Each small choice is a tiny rebellion against the system built to keep you hooked. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us make those choices, we can start to undo the damage of the 1980s. We can break the cycles, rebuild our relationships with food, and remember that eating isn't supposed to be about cravings and guilt and addiction. It's supposed to be about nourishment, about pleasure, about connecting with the people we love over meals that actually feed us. The 1980s food revolution changed America forever. It made companies rich and people sick. It turned convenience into crisis and pleasure into addiction. But that story doesn't have to be our future. We can learn from what happened, understand how we got here, and choose a different path forward. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, full of knowledge and maybe a little bit angry, maybe a little bit sad, remember this. Those food scientists in their laboratories were smart, but you're smarter. They engineered cravings, but you can unlearn them. They built a system designed to keep you addicted, but you can break free. It won't be easy. The snack aisle will still call your name. The drive-thru will still be convenient. The cravings will still hit at 2 a.m. But every time you choose differently, you're taking back power. You're rewriting the script they wrote for you. And who knows? Maybe 40 years from now, someone will tell the story of how America broke its addiction to processed food, how a generation finally said enough and chose health over convenience, nourishment over cravings, real food over engineered products. That story starts with you, right now, tonight. Sleep well, friends, and tomorrow, when you open your pantry or walk past that vending machine, remember, you know the truth now. You've seen behind the curtain. You understand the game, and that changes everything.